let me thank first Cengiz for his patience surviving all of my emails. So we heard obviously a lot of papers about early Ottoman history of Jerusalem. Now we're moving towards somewhat the end of the Ottoman control of Jerusalem. So here now I'm going to talk about basically the transition, the moment the city ended being ruled by the Ottomans and of course was occupied by the British. So on December 9, 1917, Ottoman, alongside German and Austrian troops, left Jerusalem, leaving British forces free access to the city. This historical moment ended Ottoman rule and opened a new and crucial era in the history of the city. So this paper will discuss at first the surrender of Jerusalem, looking at the last few days of Ottoman rule, and it will then follow the mayor of Jerusalem, Hussein al-Husayni, in his multiple attempts to deliver the decree of surrender handed to him by the last governor, Izzet Pasha. I will show the various narratives of these events and discuss why earlier chronicles and historians have omitted some parts. The second part of the paper will briefly look at the official entry of Allenby, showing that this event had been masterfully staged in London and executed following a script that should have painted the British as humble liberators of the Holy City. The last part will discuss the terminology employed by the British, as they carefully did not want to appear as occupiers. It will be shown that for a short period of time, the British had been seen positively, but not necessarily as liberators. In time, Allenby's entrance into Jerusalem had been associated with British support to Zionism and the Balfour Declaration. However, this approach contributed to the erasure of the Ottoman past of the city, rediscovered only 2 decades ago. What is certainly visible today in the run-up of a centennial is the radical change the city underwent. If not for the landmarks, Jerusalem would be unrecognizable by those who lived there 100 years ago. So let's move now to the last days of Ottoman rule and the British conquest. In the last days of Ottoman rule, tension was mounting among the people. Not only resources were scarce, but many were arrested, suspected to be spies. Members of the Husseini family were arrested because rumors reported that they were pro-British. The Christian patriarchs were deported outside Jerusalem. The Latin patriarch Filippo Camasei, for instance, and some of his associates were deported to Damascus early in November 1917. Some Zionists, too, were deported, while some Arab nationalists were hanged. Fauda, in other words, chaos, was reigning in the city in the days preceding British occupation. But there was also a strong sense of expectation, as things were going to change for the better anytime soon. The diaries of the Spanish consul Bayobar and of the Berta Veste Spafford, the leader of the American colony in Jerusalem, and as well of the memoir of Wasif Juaria, a local Christian Jerusalemite, show with great details what was going on in the city, and all, in different ways, captured the complex feelings of the Jerusalemites at that time. Outside the city walls, on the British side, things were quite different. On December 8, despite the bad weather conditions, everything was ready for the historical advance. General Allenby, both as a sign of respect, but also as a sign of opportunism, had issued the order that no fighting of any kind was to take place in the Holy City itself, in order to avoid injury to the holy places. In fact, none of the parties involved wanted to be remembered in a negative fashion. The Ottoman government wanted to rescue their religious credentials in terms of both sultanate and caliphate. Germany and Austria were Christian countries and had an image to protect both internationally and at home. Though the noise of the cannons and some bullets reached the city, the main battle was in fact fought outside the walls. Those days were cold and rainy. Major Locke noted in his diary that great was the discomfort caused to the men by the rain, fog, and the mud. And to many, this looked like the Somme and the Marne on the Western Front. Back in the city, while Bayobar thought about the consequences of a battle in the streets of Jerusalem, Ottoman and German troops were leaving. The Ottoman governor and German and Austrian consul fled through the night. The night before the British arrival in the city passed very quietly, and the last Ottoman soldier is said to have left the city early in the morning of December 9 through St. Stephen's Gate. The battle for Jerusalem was over. In fact, it never took place. In the long report by Allenby, he stated that, quote, "The London troops and yeomanry occupied the line across the Nablus-Jerusalem road, while Welsh troops occupied positions east of Jerusalem and on the Jericho road," end of quote. These operations de facto isolated Jerusalem. Allenby also stated that, quote, "About noon, the enemy sent out a parlementaire and surrendered the city," end of quote. However, things have been more complex. The question of a surrender of Jerusalem was an ideological tool to exploit. Therefore, it should not be surprising if there are many different accounts of this event. December 9, 1917 was a Sunday. After the heavy rain of the previous week, that Sunday was sunny and cloudless, according to the military report of the Royal Air Force. Once the last Ottoman soldier left the city, the surrender of Jerusalem began in the American colony, when the mayor, al-Husayni, knocked at the door of the Spafford's family. He announced them that he was going to deliver the letter of surrender to the English troops. Lady Spafford warned him not to go without a white flag, the famous one that we see in the picture. This was the first step of one of the numerous surrenders that took place that day. So here I will follow two of the main surrender narratives. The first one will follow a crowd who left Jerusalem looking for the British, and the second will follow the mayor and his attempt to deliver the keys of the city. Now, as soon as the inhabitants realized that the Ottomans left, crowds were leaving the walls looking for British outposts. Bayobar noted that in the morning along Jaffa Road, outside the walls, pillage was the main activity of the Jerusalemites. Now, going back to the crowds wandering around the city, it was one of these group of people that met a British soldier, Private Murch, who, being a cook, was looking for eggs for his officers. In fact, he was sent by his superiors to look for some fresh supplies like milk or eggs. This episode is rather amusing and did not sound heroic or reasonably enough epic to be officially reported. In the meantime, another civilian crowd met two British privates of the 220th Battalion London Regiment, Private Church and Private Andrews, who were seeking water in the outskirts of Jerusalem. While the crowds of the city were busy looking for whatever or whoever outside the walls, the mayor was looking for British officers with the purpose to officially surrender the city. Al-Husayni and his party at first met Sergeant Harcombe and Sergeant Sedgwick of the 219th Battalion London Regiment on the outpost duty, who refused to accept the surrender of the city. In fact, not only were the soldiers of the proper rank to accept the surrender, but they were unsure whether the mayor was in fact genuine. You can imagine, two soldiers meeting a gentleman going around trying to surrender the city of Jerusalem. I must have looked bizarre. They soon after called their superiors, Lieutenant Colonel Bailey, Major Cook, and Major Beck, who entered in conversation with the mayor. This meeting, too, was somewhat bizarre. Bailey walked towards al-Husayni, quote, "There he was with 3 chairs in a row on a road." Bailey sat down with the mayor on one side and the chief of the municipal police on the other. Finally, the mayor was able to read the act of surrender. Bailey then telegraphed Major General Shea and arranged for the occupation of some of the key buildings inside the city. The mayor, however, did not hand the decree of surrender issued by its head Pasha, Mutasarrif of Jerusalem, but he just read, as I mentioned earlier. Some other report says that, in fact, he memorized the decree and he left the document at home. This is a somewhat debated issue. In fact, alongside other notables of the city, he feared that if the Ottoman army return, they would be branded as traitors. Now, the text of a surrender is worth quoting, and this is just a rough translation. This is not a word-by-word translation. Quote, "Due to the severity of the siege of a city and the suffering that this peaceful country has endured from your heavy guns, and for the fears that these deadly bombs will hit the holy places, we are forced to hand over to you the city from Hussein Bey al-Hussein, the mayor of Jerusalem, hoping that you will protect Jerusalem the way we have protected for more than 500 years. Signed, it's at the Mutasarrif of Jerusalem." End of quote. At the same time, Brigadier General Watson, commander of the 180th Brigade, arrived at the spot and also accepted the surrender of Jerusalem from al-Husseini. However, details of this particular event, in the same way as the other surrenders, were removed from official reports. An order, in fact, was issued to the effect that evidence should be destroyed, including photographs and negatives of General Watson's acceptance. Only evidence regarding Allenby was to be recorded. We are lucky that eventually one of the photographers decided to keep the negatives that ended up in recent times at the Imperial War Museums in London. Around noon, Major General Shia was ordered by General Chetwood, commander of the 20th Corps, to take over the city. After a short surrender ceremony, another one, he accepted the keys of the city in the name of Allenby. At this point, after 400 years of Ottoman rule, Jerusalem was delivered to British forces. Now, in comparison with the events just discussed, the British government issued only a short official document on the circumstances of the surrender of the city, which detailed the involvement of a parlementaire sent out by the enemy on December 9th. It is difficult to quote a specific official narrative of the takeover, as Jerusalem was won with no actual fight due to the abandonment of the city by Ottoman German troops. The occupation of Jerusalem was, however, a powerful political symbol to be exploited at home and against the enemy. The fact that there are no official reports on the early attempts of the mayor to deliver the city also demonstrates the high symbolic value attached to the city by the British. The surrender needed to be glorious. So we move now to December 11, 2 days later. Allenby made his formal entry into Jerusalem following plans which had been carefully devised by Mark Sykes. He entered the city through Jaffa Gate on foot, in contrast to the German Emperor William II, who, in 1898, had entered the city riding a horse. The Daily Mail noted the difference with pride. Quote, "As a conqueror, General Allenby entered Jerusalem on December 11 with more simplicity and true dignity than Kaiser Wilhelm did, when he presented himself as a blend of cook's tourist and envoy of Allah." End of quote. Allenby was followed by a procession of British military officials, two small Italian and French contingents, and representatives of the religious communities. He then read in English, French, Italian, Arabic, Hebrew, and possibly other languages, the proclamation of martial law, stressing that the British would maintain the existing customs in relation to the holy places. The text read was vague and de facto promised religious freedom. Quote, "I, Allenby, make it known to you that every sacred building, monument, holy spot, shrine, traditional site, endowment, pious bequest, or customary place of prayer of whatsoever form of the three religions will be maintained and protected according to the existing customs and beliefs of whose faiths they are sacred." End of quote. At this stage, however, Jerusalemites were generally just happy that the war was over. Paradoxes and inconsistencies of British wartime policies were yet to become apparent. So the British were saying, "We're not occupiers." The occupation of Jerusalem and Allenby's proclamation need to be looked through the lenses of symbolism. The loss of Jerusalem represented a heavy blow for the Ottomans, and its conquest served to uplift morale in Britain, compared to the bad news coming from the Western Front. Abigail Jacobson argued that the occupation of Jerusalem posed serious problems for the British, as they could not occupy the city without a strategy that would make them look as benevolent occupiers or in fact as liberators. There were different opinions among British officials, including members of the Anglican Church. For instance, the Anglican bishop in Jerusalem, Rennie McInnes, writing from Cairo, where he spent the wartime years, suggested, quote, to take possession of every building erected originally as a Christian church, which is now used as a Mohammedan mosque. In other words, he was suggesting to take back buildings that were now used as mosques and convert them into churches once again. McInnes represents the views of those who saw the occupation of Palestine as a Christian conquest against the Muslims, or a triumph of the West over the East. Clearly, the occupation of Jerusalem split the British, and military concerns clashed with religious interests. In the end, pragmatism won, as this was an extremely sensitive matter, including relations with the Allies, the French and the Italians, and with the locals. The British chose to show that this was just a military occupation determined by the ongoing conflict. The occupation of Jerusalem should not have been interpreted as political, religious, or in fact colonial. The ceremony that took place on December 11, discussed earlier, did not show any Christian feature. No Allied flags were allowed to fly, and no reference to liberation of Jerusalem were made. It was, after all, a military ceremony. And here, Eitan Bar Yosef noted that it was the absence of any Christian feature and of explicit reference to the British victory that pointed, paradoxically, to the real presence of the British and Christian ethos. Religious tolerance turned into a Christian quality that represented justice and righteousness, all British virtues that needed to be implemented and taught to the local population. So let me reach some conclusion here. That the British were welcomed as liberators should not come as a surprise. The harsh living conditions for which Jerusalemites lived can be counted amongst the reasons for which locals welcomed the new rulers. We also should consider that in the end, the Ottoman project of a multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, and multi-religious empire collapsed throughout the war, when local nationalism triumphed over the idea of Osman Leluk. The honeymoon, however, was short-lived, and signs of discontent became apparent as early as 1918, when the content of the Balfour Declaration was heard in Jerusalem. We must say that officially it was published only in 1920, but obviously people knew about it. And the Zionist Commission was allowed to settle in Jerusalem. William Yale, an American subject who spent most of the years of the war in Jerusalem, later to become member of the King Crane Commission, captured essentially the shift, and at the end of the honeymoon. Quote, "It is rather significant that in Palestine, where there has been so much suffering and privation, and where the dissatisfaction with the Turkish regime was so great in 1916 and 1917, that nearly every Arab talked about treason against the Ottoman government and longed for the deliverance of the country from the Turks, there should be in the spring of 1918 a party that wished to live in the future under the sovereignty of Turkey. This party believes that under Turkish rule, the Zionists would not be allowed to gain a stronger foothold in Palestine than they have now." Perhaps Yale was right, even though we must say that there's a lot of current research done, particularly on Jamal Pasha, and I'm one of those scholars, showing that there was a lot of dealing between the Ottoman regimes and the Zionists. So it's hard to prove that eventually the Ottomans would have not supported some Zionist organization in the region. Anyway, what really matters is that the British failed to understand the nature of intercommunal relations and applied uncritically their colonial model with devastating consequences. As millets were transformed into national communities, the recipe for conflict was laid down. Looking back at those events 100 years later, we can see how the British occupation of Jerusalem changed the city and the ways it was developing. The city was relentlessly transformed from a place of relatively peaceful coexistence to a contested site of national struggle. On December 11, 2017, in a few months, many will remember or even celebrate the centennial of the British occupation. Perhaps, like in a football match, we should take a minute of silence to consider how we got here and how we may move forward. Teşekkürler.
Thank you.